Okay, everyone. So once more, thank you for joining us today in another webinar organized by the Movement for Liberation from Nakba. And today's webinar, the topic is going to be on Palestinian youths and their perspectives on the struggle for the idea of the liberation of Palestine itself, and also what it means for the future of Palestine as well. But the most important thing to take away, I hope to convey in this webinar today, is what we all would like to convey is about the future of the struggle for liberation itself and what it means for the future generations. So that's why the perspectives of what the youths of this struggle has to say is very much important, because they're the ones that are going to carry into the future and carry forth a strong tradition of what it means to struggle against oppression and, of course, against some powerful force that seeks to craft its own history and place itself above all others. So without talking too much more on my side on that one, I would like to pass the floor to our moderator for the session, and of course our first speaker, Arich Jafari. Arich, the floor is yours. I'd like to open it up to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Hassanin. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I hope you're all doing well and safe and healthy. It's such an honor for me to be here, and I'm very grateful. And thank you, MLN, so much for organizing this event and for including me as part of your guest speakers with a great group of people with us from different parts of the Middle East and the world. I think it's fundamental to strengthen our efforts in advocacy for Palestinian cause in the East and the South of the world. A lot of efforts are more geared toward the North and the West of the globe. However, our cultural and socioeconomic affinity with the global South and East is underrated and has a huge potential that we should really explore. I'm going to jump directly in my research, but I'm not going to bore you so much with the details of methodology, but just a brief background about the research. I'm looking into the question of statehood and refugees and return. I'm asking, what are the dominant preferences and expectations of Palestinian refugees in terms of statehood and the possibility of return? I look specifically at what are the economic, social, demographic characteristics of Palestinian refugees by different categories of return and statehood preferences. You know, I'm trying to see what are the preferences of refugees on where they wish to return to in a future scenario, and what are their preferences for repatriation. How does the history of changes in refugees' residence affect preferences on return and statehood? The targeted group that I look at is Palestinian refugees who are displaced in 1948, 1967, and their descendants. I look at the refugees above the age of 18 years old, men and women living in the West Bank or Gaza, inside or outside refugee camps. I'm doing a quantitative and qualitative research. I have a random representative sample for the quantitative questionnaire and a selected number of interviews for more in-depth analysis to kind of revalidate some of the quantitative research findings. I've done the first phase of the data collection this year in May through July in the West Bank, and currently I'm in Jordan preparing to launch the second phase of the data collection. Today, what I'm going to share with you is some of my initial results and impressions in the context of today's topics, the Palestinian youth and their vision for a future, only based on the data from the West Bank. So it's quite specific, let's say. I want to highlight my background before I go in the research. I'm a refugee. My grandparents were displaced from a village called Deir Rafat. It is just 41 kilometers away from where I was born. I was born in a refugee camp called Deheisha near the city of Bethlehem. I was born before the first Intifada, so I've lived through the first and the second Intifada. I've lived through the initial stages of Oslo. I witnessed how Palestine has transformed under the Israeli apartheid system over the past 3 decades. And it's a heavy thing to actually see. So going into my results, the big results, almost everyone, considered returning. We're talking about 87% of the sample is considered returning to live in historical Palestine or to their original village, against only 9.3%, they have said they're not considering returning. I'm going to only focus the major of my highlights here on the people who are returning. And here are some of the impressions that I found. And please do consider these are just rough results. Lots of more analysis are needed yet, but they're still significant in so many different ways. There are some differences between, very small differences, really small differences between the ages categories. And I look in terms of desire to return. So there is no difference. Doesn't matter if you're 30 years old or if you're 60 years old. The differences are a few percentage points. The more differences are between men and women. Men are more likely to return than women. Another surprising finding is the location in the West Bank. Both Bethlehem and Hebron Governorate are less likely to return than people in other parts of the West Bank, like in Jenin or Nablus or in Jerusalem. And just to give you an idea, only 69% of the women against 94% of the men in Bethlehem are wish to return. In Hebron, also 73% of the women against 90% of the men, they wish to return. But if we look at Nablus, both men and women are above 95%. They desire to return. So it's a huge difference between the governorate of the West Bank. Another thing that I actually find surprising is there's also little difference between people living outside the camp or inside the camp. I was expecting that inside the camp might have a higher percentage. It's actually outside the camp was slightly higher, but still very small difference. If we look at the difference between men and women in terms of education, it doesn't really matter. There's no difference, no matter what level of education or number of years of education. If we look at the social status and gender, married women are less likely to return than married men. And we can talk about it in a second why. If we look at the return options based on assets ownership, so if people have a house, a car, a business, a land, or multiple assets, did not really show a consistent trend. So a person owning 2 assets is more likely to return than a person owning 1 asset. However, a person who's owning 3 or 4 assets are less likely to return. So it goes either way. And these are some of the descriptive figures so far. If we control for all the variables in a multivariate regression, a statistical model, there are 2 statistical factors that are very significant. And you might have guessed it yourself. One is gender, and the second one is the location of both Bethlehem and Hebron. So women are more communal. Women think of the others before they think of themselves. From the interviews, what I heard women saying, I would return if my husband, if my children, if my brothers are going to be returning. So they first think who before them will return, and then I would be part of that. So in a way, also women are a little bit more realistic in looking at the question. They also value a lot the kinship relationship and connections, which is not, in a way, is not surprising. The other factor is the location. I did not hypothesize about the location within the West Bank. I didn't expect any impact of the location on the refugees' preferences to return. I haven't seen anything of that in any of the literature. I still have to really investigate why this is a factor and see how can where you are determine your outlook to the future. So this is on the return side. On the factors that are influencing the state options, and before I give you some of the results, I look into 4 different preferences for refugees return within states. So 4 state options. I start with the current option that is being discussed for the past 3 decades, the two-state solution. I look into whether Palestinians would wish to return to one binational democratic state for both people in historical Palestine. I look into a confederal state, 2 different regions with high level of integrations, something maybe similar to what we see in the European Union. And before I go even and I give the people the 4th option, I do ask the participants, why would none of these frameworks would appeal to you to return to? And most answers were basically saying, it's our land. We are living under occupation. None of these frameworks would work. We want to liberate the land, and these frameworks, we will not do any justice to our cause. And then I give them the last option, which is the Palestinian state from the river to the sea. The results are not surprising in the sense that we have 100% of both men and women would return to live in one Palestinian state. No matter what demographic or socioeconomic factor I look at, the result for this option is 100%. And I would say this is an inspirational option, and I can explain a little bit later why. Conversely, the desire to return to other state options is very low. And I will give you an example that 80.7% would return under the framework of the two-state solution. Just tell you, less than 10% of the people would support that. And also less than 10% also would return under a confederate state of Israel and Palestine regions with Jerusalem as a unified capital. While 18.3% would only return under the binational democratic state framework. If we look at the factors that are really determining the Palestinians' preference for state to return to, here's some interesting issues. If we look at gender, only 22% of men and 13% of women would return to one binational state. If we look at the return state by location, in general, there's a strong support in Nablus and Hebron for multiple options of the type of state. But if we look at Jenin and Jerusalem, there is less attraction to these type of states. Just so that you know, like Jerusalem had zeros for some of these options, which is also not surprising because Jerusalem, for example, was not really included solidly in the two-state solution. For younger people, as I defined them earlier, for 18 to 20 years old, who wish to return, there is really less attraction to these alternative types of states comparing to the older group. But their prevalent preference is the Palestinian state from the river to the sea. Another thing that I found, which was interesting, is people with lower education have higher preference to return to one binational democratic state, both men and women. And this could be that usually the older people, they have less education, and yet they still remember living side by side with Jews before 1948. And when I talk about older people, I mean people older than 60 years old, comparing to other age categories. So this is for return. The last part of my speech here is that I'm looking at, both people who are returning and not returning. And I try to investigate some issues regarding the realism of type of state, the organization that should represent the refugees, and the ways that we as refugees think we can obtain our Palestinian refugee rights. And I asked them about what type of state we think is plausible in the next 5 years. The first one and the highest is that 58% believe that the most plausible state form to exist is the current apartheid system that we have. And even in some of the surveys and the interview, people said it's even going to get worse in the next 5 years. While you have 25% believe it's going to be a Palestinian state. And this is why I think it's inspirational. People think in the next 5 years, we will have a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. However, we don't really see any kind of factors that can support such a kind of thing. But people still hope this might happen. The other options, state options, we have 8% believe in the two-state solution. 5% actually believe that Israel will annex the West Bank. Less than 2% believe there will be one binational state or a confederate state. In contrast, the picture might look slightly different, according to them, in the next 20 years. 28% believe that the most plausible state form to exist is the current apartheid system. So almost half of who believe that will exist in the next 5 years. While you have 55% believe that the Palestinian state will emerge. So almost double the number who thought that we will have a state. And again, we still don't see a lot of factors that can support really this form of state. The other state forms, actually, there was not a huge variation from the 5 years, so it's quite close. In terms of which is the institution that we can say best entrusted to lead the negotiation and support of the Palestinian refugees' rights and advocate for their return, the main results showing that the Palestinian refugees in general reject the current institutions. They are overwhelmingly in favor of a newly elected refugee body. And this is higher percentage among youth who would like to have this new body comparing to the other age categories. There's also a rejection of Palestinian Authority, of Hamas, or even the Palestinian Liberation Organization or the United Nations. And I was struck by how many young people did not know what the PLO is. And it's quite interesting that that kind of shows you the void of political organizing, the political advocacy among young people about the solo representative of Palestinian refugees, but also it reflects on the weakness of the PLO today. In terms of what people think is necessary for us to get and obtain the rights of the Palestinian refugees and to be implemented, on the top of the list is the armed struggle and the resistance. So despite all the hardship that people face, despite all the difficulties that Israel puts for people who kind of associate themselves with the armed struggle, people still look at the armed struggle as solution as the main solution for us to obtain our rights. And this is actually stronger for younger people and the much older age categories. The armed struggle is followed by the pressure from international community as a solution, as a tool to help us. And this relates to how the Palestinians, especially the refugees, they don't necessarily see the liberation of Palestine as an issue disconnected from the regional or even the global context. And they see that the decolonization of Palestine goes beyond the Palestinian people alone. In terms of what individual refugees are doing in the face of the settler colonial oppressor, the most prevalent choice was steadfasting, Sumud, which Rami, after me, actually is going to talk. He's researching about Sumud. Would be interesting to hear from him. And Sumud here could be defined in so many ways. The way I heard it from people is that teaching their offspring about the rights, raising awareness among younger generation, not giving up on the rights, not selling the rights, not immigrating, etc. And that's how people see that they are contributing to the current fight. The second option that people are doing themselves is the political organizing, unionizations, and advocacy through social media. And here is the power of organizing is so prevalent among young people. So in summary, almost everyone wants to return, though significant differences by gender and location. People overwhelmingly want to return to a Palestinian state, and there is relatively little support for other solution, no matter the age. And there is little support for existing political international institutions to help negotiate and implement the right of return. Refugees want a new body representing their rights. Thank you so much. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce my dear friend, Rami Remela. Hi, Rami. It's good to have you with us. Rami,
Hello,
thank you for being with us. Rami is a social and cultural psychologist who is currently a doctoral research and an associate lecturer at the University of Exeter. We're both our colleagues since we both are studying in Exeter. And his thesis explores the role of Sumud in relation to different power formation that shapes the Palestinian refugee experiences in Lebanon refugee camps. So Rami, I'm gonna put for you 3 questions, and you can decide which one you want to address first. But what is your vision for the future Palestinian modes of liberation, decolonization? Do you think young people involved enough in the liberation? And if not, why is that in your opinion? And the last one, can you really unpack the vision a bit about what is the vision for the future? What is the possible elements, such as questions of 1 state, 2 state, right of return, freedom could look like? Over to you, Rami.
Thank you so much, Ariz, and apologies that my camera is not working. I'll keep trying in a bit. It should turn on eventually. So I'd like to start first by saying thank you so much for the organizers for organizing such an important webinar that amplifies our voices as Palestinian youth and sheds light on the heterogeneity of our experience. While the root cause of our suffering is mutual as Palestinians in different geographies, the violence that we experience sits on a continuum ranging from acts and policies of exclusion and discrimination to displacement and ethnic cleansing. I'd like to start first by giving a general background that allows our audience to get a grasp on the situation of the 200,000 Palestinian refugees living in 12 refugee camps in Lebanon. Me being one of many Palestinians who grew up in refugee camps in Lebanon, I'd like to say that these camps that since 1948 have suffered several massacres, famines, sieges, and most recently exclusion and marginalization. The continuous existence of these camps is a testimony of the Zionist settler colonial violence that transcends the border of historic Palestine and Al-Nakba. Today, 200,000 Palestinian refugees are living in Lebanon, not only sentenced to live in exile, but also denied political involvement, excluded from the Palestinian National Council, and they do consider themselves unheard and underrepresented. They're living in extreme poverty with high unemployment rate. I'm not giving this general background about the camps to say that they are just suffering, because I'd also like to shed light on their acts of resistance that is most of the time dismissed, especially recently after they have been labeled as refugees, as passive, as apolitical. These camps remain the womb of steadfastness and struggle that gave birth to many of the Palestinian intellects and freedom fighters that we talk about every year. And while in the 50s and the 60s, the Palestinian revolution that started in the refugee camps involved armed struggle, today Palestinians living in Lebanon do not have access to the same resources, yet they still engage in different types of resistance through education, advocacy, through cooperation and unity with one another to help themselves remain alive and committed to the cause and one step closer to liberation, which what Arish talked about and called Sumud. I did recently a report that was published by the European Parliament that shed light on the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and asked them questions about representation, their vision on solutions. And I would like to just share the link here before going to, if anyone likes to check. Okay, so I'd like to start first by answering your first question, Arij, about the future Palestinian modes of liberation and decolonization. And I would say to understand our modes of liberation as Palestinian and not to homogenize or dismiss one mode of liberation over the other, I'd like to borrow here Ghassan Kanafani's way of responding to the question with another question by asking liberation from what exactly and decolonizing what. While the root of our suffering is one called Zionism and can be tied to imperialism, racism, Orientalism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia, the violence inflicted on us is structural and institutionalized. It is exercised through various wars, as Salman Abu Sitta states, that is not limited to military, but also politically, with the role of the US and the veto it plays. Historically, where we're blank in imperialist textbooks, especially in the West, defamation, we're called terrorist if we defend or we stand for our rights, or called anti-Semitic, which most of the time lead to legal consequences, changing in domestic laws, criminalizing the BDS movement, for example, or cutting funds to UNRWA. Another type of war is economic, with the blockade on Gaza, and geographical, with the constant erasing of Palestine from the map, the drawing of the borders that split families and antagonize conflict based on ethnicity, and silencing, that we're most of the time silenced, especially nowadays on social media, and in Western media and on all platforms in general. The reason I unfold all these words and tactics the settler colonial state uses is to say that our modes of liberation and decolonization have always taken different shapes to respond to these wars, and it has never been limited to armed struggle. Our future modes of liberation include learning from those who came before us, especially the Palestinian intellects that were able to advocate and frame our cause within broader struggle of justice, democratization, human rights, and equality, that were able to learn and create transnational solidarity networks with other oppressed groups, and were able to reach every corner of the world, from Chiapas in Mexico to Cape Town in South Africa. So engaging in all forms of liberation and decolonization acts, whether it's economic, academic, or political, is very much crucial. Like you mentioned in your survey, Arish, that most of the young are advocating for the armed struggle as a choice. I see it as more diverse. All acts of liberation are needed when we talk about the settler colonial state that mobilizes all kinds of aspects to eliminate the Palestinians. As for the young Palestinians' involvement in the liberation, and if not, why do I think they are not involved? I think if I've been asked this before, the May events, or what we call as Palestinians as Habba, I would have replied pessimistically. But being one of the many co-organizers and mobilizers working online on many platforms, I was able to see how much work the Palestinian youth and their allies were doing all these years. Most of these working groups actually work anonymously online. They organize, mobilize, educate, translate, and constantly create spaces for reflection and action. Not in the formal, structural, or political body sense, but more grassroots based. And this is because we are not allowed as youth, as Palestinian youth, to join any formal or political body. Me, as a Palestinian refugee from Lebanon, a few years ago, when I wanted to work in politics, I was denied by the Palestinian Authority because I don't have papers. I'm not considered Palestinian. I'm also only a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, and I cannot even work with Lebanon. So my only choice was to actually work at the European Parliament. So we're not giving those choices, even though when they come to the international arena in a place like the European Parliament, uh, the European Parliament members usually tell the Palestinian leadership there is more youth needed, we need more representation from youth, and yet there is no response to that. To continue and give you an example on the Palestinian youth involvement, especially in May events, so it's shedding light on the Sheikh Jarrah forced eviction and Al Kurd family was a coordinated effort by many Palestinian groups who launched what they called an electronic storm with the hashtag that went viral to shed light on the event. So it wasn't just random, it was a coordinated effort by many Palestinians that mobilized and had a strategy to how to shed light on the Sheikh Jarrah event. Other groups also organized media coverage on the ground after Al-Aqsa event, live coverage on Gaza, fundraising for Al-Quds Hospital, translating news to different languages and sharing on Twitter. There was massive work being done on many platforms that I didn't know they existed before, where they had many foreigners and allies of Palestine that were translating the news to their original languages, and also writing tweets that can easily be copied with the hashtags to reach a certain audience. So all these actions were taken actually by youth, and I see them as acts of liberation from the Western media bias and the anti-Palestinian discourse. There is also more formal and political body structure in a sense, like the PYM in the US and other places. And when we talk about the camps and the refugee camps in Lebanon in specific, I know many Palestinian youth who started their own initiative. They are very much aware of the uh, uh, donor uh, donor agenda and what they most of the time demand from those they give funding to, and they are not taking from any donor. They are doing fundraising, and all of this to to create spaces and curriculums that teaches Palestinian youth about the Palestinian geography, the Palestinian cause, because they live in Lebanon, yet they study the Lebanese curriculum. And they are building libraries, they do visits to the border. So youth are involved, not in the explicit political sense, but if we search, we find their involvement. And it is very crucial and important to shed light on those initiatives. But on the other side, some youth actually decide to remain anonymous or to do it not explicitly. But there is involvement, and all of these resistance acts or modes of liberation are important, with as much as they are diverse, whether they are explicit or implicit. And finally, to reflect with you on the vision and the possible elements, like one state, two state, right of return. I personally feel that the question of one state, two state so much focuses on the land and not on the people or our demands. Our struggle as Palestinians stems from the fact that there is an ideology that treats us as inferior and demands publicly and explicitly our annihilation. Whether it is one state or two state, our suffering will persist if Zionism persists. While we, on the other hand, chant nothing but our freedom, our liberation, and we don't demand to be on the other side of the pole as oppressors. So it is the Zionists that should be asked, do they envision a state where people live equally and justice is served? And by justice, I mean restorative justice, restoring what has been taken from us, a public apology and acknowledgement of the Nakba, and to be given our right to choose, to return or not to return, but at least given the right to choose. I think that was part of the leadership pitfall, like with the Oslo agreement, that they went actually and negotiated and compromised, where human rights and justice cannot be compromised. Like you cannot quantify them. You cannot say, I will let you live a 60% dignified life or 60% freedom. So what they did actually in the Oslo Accord is they reduced the solution to a number that can be quantified and compromised our demands. And our demands today stand clear that we demand justice, rights, and equality, whether it is and this eventually leads to one state. And as a Palestinian refugee who's still living with no status and a refugee from Lebanon, I think the right of return should be on the top of the list in any discussion, because it opens the conversation to speaking about who and why are we denied this right? How did we end up being refugees in the first place? And how can restorative justice be achieved? And this is exactly why the leadership left the core of the knot unanswered and postponed, while the people await in camps. Lastly, I would like to say that most of the time when we think about a free Palestine and freeing Palestine, and that's why I am saying it focuses so much on the land, we dismiss the human dimension, that we as Palestinians are living as oppressed, and the occupation or the settled colonialism is affecting our daily lives wherever we live. And our acts of liberation are acts on daily basis. We don't see liberation just as an end destination, but it's a process. Every day we're engaging in acts of liberation to feel free as Palestinians, whether with moving and education, with work. We always have to make these intimate conversations among ourselves to remain committed to the cause and to justice. I hope I answered most of them. But, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rami. And I reiterate that it is what it comes about right of return. It is the right to choose. And I tackle that also in my research in different ways. And I do ask people about, as part of this return, what exactly is the demand beyond just the return? But I want to highlight that people keep putting your questions in the Q&A, and we have a session later on to tackle them. And thank you so much for writing these down. Very much appreciated. Please keep putting them there. Now I want to turn to Alia. Alia is a PhD student in the law department, the University of Exeter. She has worked as a parliamentary consultant in international relations. She's a feminist and a political activist. Alia, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hassanel, can you please share my presentation? Thank you. Just a second. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Alia Zabe. I'm Palestinian. I would like to thank the Movement for Liberation and Professor Ilan Papi for inviting me to this session and giving me this platform to talk about my vision regarding the future of decolonized Palestine. So Hassanel, the next slide, please. Thank you. So let's take a look here at this map. As we can see, Israel continues to build settlements in Palestinian areas and encourage more Israeli Jews to move and live there, thus deepening the occupation even more. The white areas that you can see here in the middle are Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territories, and the green areas are the areas under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian National Authority, with Fatah in control of the West Bank and Hamas in control of Gaza. Next slide, please. So right now, in terms of population and demographics, this is sort of how Palestine looks like. The West Bank consists of 2.7 million Palestinians, Gaza consists of 1.8 million Palestinians, and the occupied territories, 1.9 million Palestinians and 6.8 million Israeli Jews. The next slide, please, Hassanel. So this gray area in the middle here, this is where the Palestinian population, the community that I come from, is concentrated. It's called the lands of the 48. So the tightening restrictions on the Palestinians everywhere have caused tension to rise for decades. Currently, the Israeli government and population ignore the existence of the Palestinian question in a semi-total manner. The Israeli media does not report on the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians in general, or the Israeli army killing of Palestinian civilians, or raiding of houses, home demolitions, child arrests that happen on a daily basis. Of course, this goes in the interest of the Israeli government to keep everyone, including Israelis themselves, silent. So these conditions have contributed to the acute rise of the right-wing camp in Israel, which promote Israeli nationalism, racism, and all of this, of course, is targeted against the Palestinians themselves. Next slide, please. So in the past 10 years or so, we have seen a new independent movement of Palestinian youth that are inherently challenging the traditional and old leadership of Palestinian people, especially in the West Bank and inside of Israel. The next slide, please. So we are talking about the third generation of the Nakba, which means the grandchildren of the Palestinians that went through the war and suffered from the Nakba in the 48. This generation is unafraid to portray and emphasize their Palestinian identity and heritage, to even hold the flag, to learn about their history and heritage and teach the younger generation, which wasn't there before, to visit the Palestinian displaced villages and towns and participate in national events, and to organize. Only the idea of taking the theory of decolonization to the ground and to organize in new movements and take their resistance against the Israeli occupation to the streets in a new waves of protests and uprisings. So the next slide, please. Many of the new youth movements engage in on-site resistance against the occupation by protesting, marching, dismaintaining information in Palestinian villages and towns. So this here is an example of a new movement called Haifa Youth Movement. So many of these movements that I'm talking about, they tend to promote volunteering for the community and help local NGOs that deal with poverty and other social issues. Some of the movements just focus on one local issue in a village or a town, and then they become part of the wider resistance network. Next slide, please. The next one also. So last year, Rami just talked about this, an extraordinary movement took place and was led by those same newly emerging youth movements all over Palestine against the Israeli restrictions and occupation. It all started in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, where they were trying to displace the Kurd family and other families. So at the same time, while opposition was building up against the Israeli moves in Jerusalem, Israeli forces imposed further restrictions on Palestinians in Jerusalem. This led to the 2021 uprising. So this uprising included strikes, marches, protests, community events like graffitis, social discussions, food sharing, educational activities for children, putting up national symbols and flags that wasn't really common before in Palestinian towns, on rooftops, on windows, national music, lectures, voluntary work. I just want to say that, you know, this is really unusual, like talking in public about our visions and, you know, moving freely, expressing our opinions about a decolonized Palestine wasn't there before. And just to like conclude what I said so far, a new wave of unapologetic Palestinian movements is emerging across Palestinian lands. These movements are not afraid, as I said, to express their Palestinian identity. You know, some people used to identify before as Israeli Arabs or to try to hide their Palestinian identities. Today, this generation is teaching the young generation to say, no, we are Palestinians and we will remain Palestinians no matter what. These movements are engaging in confrontation with the Israeli occupation. They're challenging the traditional Palestinian leadership, especially over how to resist the occupation and how to build a new Palestinian future. This change of mind and direction might have a huge consequences when it comes to who leads the Palestinian people, especially with the change in reality and in the growing weakness of the Palestinian National Authority and the different Palestinian parties. So this in return will affect how Palestinians will resist the occupation, what will happen in terms of the Israeli reply, and how these movements that are led by people can change the whole political situation in the region. If we want to talk about one state, two-state solution, the two-state solution for me is a joke. You know, more than 500,000 Israeli settlers live illegally in Palestinian territories. They already live there. It is like a never-ending promise to Palestinians that if you just behave yourself, someday, maybe, we will be able to accept the idea of a state of your own. Just like, not yet, if you behave yourself. Meanwhile, we will continue to swallow up your land and push you off them. And America will give us $4 billion a year. So for me, yeah, the two-state solution is an absolute joke. And this is what I can say about the future. And like Rami said, what is important here is people and not only demographics and the land itself. The freedom of the people first, and then everything will come along. Thank you everyone for listening to me, and I will be accepting questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alia. That was great. It is always great to hear people Palestinian from the territory of 1948 and their kind of testimony for the reality there. We'll turn to Ahmed Abu Artima. Ahmed is a Palestinian writer and a political activist. He wrote hundreds of articles in many websites. One of the organizer and initiator behind the Great March of Return in Gaza. He's originally a refugee from Al-Ramla village. He was born in Rafah, and he's a member of the Act for Palestine team. Ahmed, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Sorry, Emma, I think we cannot hear you.
Can't hear you. We still can't hear you.
Now?
Okay.
Now, hear me now?
Yep, we can.
What about now?
Excellent.
Okay, so it sounds there's a problem in the hand phone. So I think the voice is clear now.
It's great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thanks for the organizers of this webinar. Yes, I'm speaking from my location here in Gaza. There were many events in the last few years shows us how the Palestinian struggle is still continuing, even with the many frustration and the many factors that can be against the Palestinian youth and the Palestinian situation in general. I will start with the Great March of Return, were organized in 2018, 4 years ago from now. It was a popular call to participate in this unarmed protest for the Palestinian refugees to demand their right to return to their original villages. I would like to mention that about 66% of the people, of the population of Gaza Strip are refugees. The majority of the people here are refugees, and Gaza Strip is one of the most crowding places around the world. And the people, in addition to that, they are refugees, they are under occupation, and also they are under the Israeli blockade since 15 years. So all those factors formed the miserable life of the people in Gaza. The poverty and the unemployment is very high in Gaza. Now we speak about the majority of the youth in Gaza. They are without jobs, without horizon, without hope of the future. Maybe more than the 70% of the youth in Gaza. I don't have exact statistics, but it's my impression when I live among those people and live among those people. So the youth in Gaza live in very hard conditions. But even despite of this, when me personally and a group of the activists in Gaza, when we speak with the people that let us make this initiative to try to make our voices heard around the world, to end this silent death. We were surprised with the positivity of the youth in Gaza and the positivity of the people in general. And the first day of the March of Return, March 30, 2018, there were about more than 100,000 people of participants of the Palestinian people in Gaza participating in the March of Return, and they were near the fence and they were demanding. And when I was asking anyone that, do you think that the right of return is realistic? They answered me, yes, sure, we don't have other choice. Our only choice to believe in our right to return, and it's unacceptable to stay here in our silent death inside this prison. It's actually, Gaza is actually a prison, open air. While we can see beyond the fence, we can see our stolen land that other people can enjoy and live with luxury in our land, and we are still. So we don't have anything to lose. We don't have anything to lose but to continue our struggle. When we come to what's happening in last year, 2021, on May, we remember the events started on Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, but it extended to all the Palestinian land, West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Palestinian towns inside Israel. What we saw at that time, at that moment, give us a new hope that the people, the Palestinian people, are still feels deeply their will of liberation and of freedom. Now we are about 22 years from the second intifada, and after this long year, there are new generations. Those new generations, they didn't see or they didn't participate in the direct conflict with the Israeli occupation army. But the importance of the events of the last few years, the Great March of Return, the wave of 2021 May, and also the last events in West Bank and the few last months. What's happening in West Bank now is increasing to reach to the situation of 2000, and we saw what the Israeli security officials says about that. The PA is losing its control in West Bank. In Gaza, yes, there are no direct confrontation. There is no direct physical existence of the Israeli soldiers inside Gaza. And I think this is one of the reasons, one of the psychological reasons why the youth participated in the March of Return, because it was an opportunity for them to go to the fence and to see to see physically the Israeli occupation soldiers, and this can feed their will of freedom and their national will. But despite of there are no direct confrontation with the Israeli soldiers inside Gaza, like the situation in West Bank, but the people here, the youth here, the Palestinian youth, they feels that in the time of the confrontation, like what's happening in May 2021, you see the people. Again, I don't have the statistics, but I can see the majority of the people where you can go in Gaza and ask the people. They feel that their national spirit is very high, and they were very admired to the fighters who throw the rockets from Gaza in the battles with the Israeli army. So there are many challenges and many tragedies that people, the Palestinian youth live. The very sad life under the siege and under the blockade and under the occupation. We should remember that Gaza is one of the most isolated places around the world. The majority of the youth in Gaza, they never left Gaza Strip. They never spoke with another person from another culture like what I'm doing now with you. They are in a complete, they are living in a complete isolation. And also there are inner problems. The youth in Gaza and the Palestinian youth in general feels angry because they are marginalized in the political and in the social life. We saw that the same faces of the Palestinian leaders before 20 years or 30 years, they are the same now. And this is very sad, because there are many generations, they were growing up and they want to find the place to play and to participate in the political life. So I think the people, the youth, they are searching of the opportunity to express their national role. And when it comes this opportunity, like the Great March of Return as example, we feel how the people, how the youth are positive, how the youth feels the motivation to participate and to go and to create new ideas. The March of Return was very important opportunity to give the youth a place to create new ideas and to create new and to express their dreams. So I'm trying to end. So yes, there are many obstacles that prevent the youth to participate their national role clearly, as the situation in the first Intifada as example. But when the people feels any hope, feels any opportunity, their souls are renewing. And when they see any fighter in West Bank as example, you can see how the social media, how the people in social media, all of them, that think that this hero, as example, as Ibrahim Nabulsi in Nablus before a few weeks from now, and the tens of the youth in West Bank in the last 6 months, they all the social media of the youth in Gaza, they speak and write and express that this is our hero, this is our example. So even if the reality on the ground was very hard and there are many restrictions, but I think the Palestinian dream, the Palestinian will of freedom is deeply in the hearts of the new generations, and it's only waiting an opportunity to express itself. Thank you.
Ahmed, thank you so much. It's very inspiring to hear about the experience of the Great Return March in Gaza and all the experiences you have in Gaza. And it just shows how much Palestinian youth, whether we are from Gaza or we are from Lebanon or from 48 or elsewhere, that we managed to kind of break these separation walls that Israel tried to create between us and overcome these kind of isolation, these walls between us, and try to kind of unify it around one objective, but each one of us kind of approach is slightly different. So thank you so much for sharing with us this. Now, we'll open it for Q&A. If people want to come forward, please do. We can open the floor. Otherwise, we can also start picking up some of the questions in the Q&A section. So I'll give people some time to prepare their questions, but we can start picking some of the questions in the Q&A. And the first question was about whether I asked about the desire for compensation as well as return, either for the lost land and house or for resettlements. Okay, so I had the approach that I had for this question. For the people who were not returning, I asked them if they would like to be compensated. And you know, more than 50% have said yes, they want to be compensated for their experiences, for the loss of land, etc. However, for the people who were returning, the question was slightly different. And the question was, what exactly your demand for return? And I gave them different options. And among the option is, the first option was return, full compensation, repossess of the land, the property that their grandparents or parents have owned in 1948. And that was the first option. The second option was return, repossess of the land without compensation. And the third option was return, possess part of the land and financial compensation. And the fourth was return and financial compensation alone, return only, and compensation only. And just to let you know that compensation only had really very low kind of attractions, while the first option that people wanted is full return, full reclamation of their land, and full compensation for their experiences. More than 80% of the people wanted that as kind of their rights that they are entitled to, according also to the law. I hope that answers your question, Steve. But if you have any follow-up question, please let us know. The second question is from Layla. And Layla, I think she poses a question to Rami, and maybe also other can even relate to this. How effective have the resistance campaign been on the ground, led by young Palestinians? How can these be spread as global campaigns to demand liberation for Palestine? I'm going to give the floor to Rami, but Alia and Ahmed, please feel free to jump in as you see appropriate. Over to you, Rami.
Thank you, Arish. I'm just going to take one example, the one that I presented about Sheikh Jarrah, and see how effective and how can we measure it as effective or not. In terms of Western media bias and amplifying our voices, I think it was very effective. We had celebrities sharing the discussions that you see now on any post on social media. You can see people talking in very much eloquent terms to advocate for the Palestinian cause. They know their pitfalls. They know when they would be framed as anti-Semitic or terrorists. They have a new language that caters not only for us as Palestinians, but also for the Western audience. On the ground, how did these campaigns also, how were they effective? I was living in Portugal before moving to the UK. And when I moved to Portugal 3 years ago, we didn't have as much, like the Portuguese were in solidarity. In general, they are in solidarity with Palestine, but there's not many movements or protests or gatherings happening. But after May, it changed. Like now, every month or two, you find lots of protests, gatherings, you find graffitis on the wall, the flag of Palestine. So even though those start online or on platforms, they are also moving offline and moving offline globally. Again, I think the responsibility should not just be ours as Palestinians, but also for whoever receives the message, and what to do with it is what will lead for the liberation for Palestine. Like I meet lots of colleagues that are living in Western countries, and they keep telling me, oh, I want to go to Palestine. I want to see how is it there. I want to help. And all I say, if you want to help, engage in the politics in your own country, because the politics of your local politics are the ones that are affecting or making the occupation continuous. So I hope it answers.
Thanks a lot, Rami.
Please join Rami in answering this question regarding Sheikh Jarrah and what he said and the campaign that the youth movement started then. It was very effective, yes, but on a really high price. You know, like the result was another Israeli military operation in Gaza. Jewish settlers roamed in the streets of cities in mobs, marking Palestinian homes. Business and cars were attacked. Thousands of Palestinians were arrested. I myself joined many lawyers in trying to get them out of prisons. Businesses were marked and closed because of this. So yes, this effectiveness comes on a really high price that I think is worth to pay to get to to a place of a decolonized Palestine. This is what I wanted to add.
Thanks a lot, Alia. Ahmed, do you want to come in here, or should we move on?
Yes. Please, can you repeat the question in summary?
In summary, Layla is asking how effective has this been campaigns, and how have they affected the people on the ground?
Yeah, yes, we can see clearly that how the youth let me say in the last 1 year, how they again took the initiative in Sheikh Jarrah, in Jerusalem, in West Bank, in the Palestinian cities in Israel. It's very clear to notice that there is a new spirit among the Palestinians, that the new generations who didn't participate in the second intifada, they now they discover the opportunity. What's happening in West Bank, it's noticeable, very noticeable, that the level of the confrontation between the youth and the Israeli occupation soldiers became daily events every day, and in many of the spots in Gaza Strip, in West Bank. So yes, I believe that a new stage of the Palestinian struggle is forming now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ahmed. And just one thing that I want to add is that, these campaigns actually relieve and kind of break the isolation of the Palestinian. For so many years, especially in the second intifada, we felt like we're banging our head against the wall alone, as if we are left alone. And maybe now we can feel that there is a little bit more attraction around the Palestinian cause, although it is kind of in a virtual, but Rami has kind of pointed out that it is being translated on the ground, but it kind of give people a hope that continue fighting. You're not alone. We have your back. Maybe a small percentage, but I think technology today can give us the tool that we can continue our finding. So we are using this technology as a kind of a weapon. And not surprising that the state of Israel have a whole department kind of trying to polish the image of Israel in these kind of different platforms, because they do understand the impact of these campaigns on their image, on their investment, which what really more hit home is the Israeli economy. So thank you so much, Layla. Another question also from Layla is, what is the percentage of young leadership in political participation in Palestine? And I'm not sure if Rami or Ahmed or Layla would like to pick up one of these, this question particularly. Ahmed?
Yes. Yes. Again, the question, please. In summary.
Do we have any statistics that can show the youth participation in politics in Palestine?
No, unfortunately. I appreciate the statistics you mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, so I can refer to you in this statistics.
So unfortunately, we don't really have updated statistics in terms of the percentage of young people in the leadership, but I can tell you the average age of the political leadership is 80 years old and above. And that kind of reflects on what is the youth participation in. And I think we need to be clear and kind of define what's political participation. Are we defining public office? Are we defining political parties? Are we talking about local organization? Because in terms of local organization, for what I understand from Alia, from Rami, it's mostly run by youth, but these are not organized political parties. These are not, usually are more popular, kind of spontaneous organizing events and initiatives. But when really it comes to political party or political institution, it's unfortunately youth are silent. Youth are absent from that, let alone that most of our political institutions did not have elections for more than 15 to 20 years. So already a whole generation is not representative in the political parties that are leading Palestinians, whether it was inside Palestine or in the diaspora. But I don't know if Alia or Rami would also like to comment on this.
I would just like to add to what you just said about these youth movements. They're also not funded. So they only last for a short period of time, and then they cannot maintain what they're doing because of the lack of money. So this is also one of the reasons why if there's a future for these movements, there are things that prevent them from continuing their work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alia. Rami?
I can only speak on on the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and there is no political participation. They are just not considered, like they don't have the passport. Even the embassy doesn't represent them. So there is no political participation. The only, if you want to put it in a formal faction way, they can be recruited by different factions in the camp, and they serve in the camp, and they get a salary. But this is another topic. Like this is another way of still controlling their lives, but not giving them a way to express their demands.
Thanks a lot, Rami. I just want to tell Aruna, I apologize. I thought participant can speak. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the case. So Aruna, please type your question in the Q&A section. Thank you so much. Moving on, and please, Ilan, Hassanal, and Rajan, please come in as you feel you would like to participate here. You probably also have a huge experience from your background on this. Moving on this next question from Steve, and this is addressed to Rami. Steve is saying, is there a mechanism whereby Palestinians can produce political leaders? Example, the occupation movement had widespread support, but its lacks of individual leaders meant institutional or structural change was limited. Elected leadership within the PLO or other bodies.
Thank you, Steve, for the question. I don't think that there's any way to produce political leaders in a fair or democratic way, because the people in charge, the leadership in charge, is repressing any political opinion. We've been with no elections for I don't know how much, but then the question is, how can we produce political leaders? I think most of our organization and initiatives that we've been doing over the years as youth are reactive initiatives or reactive popular movement, as Arish said, very spontaneous. And what we actually need is proper political education and proper campaigns that educate Palestinians politically. And then the change would occur. And this is related also to John's question about the signs of youth cooperation and more formal organization. I would like to say here that I've been organizing with some of my colleagues and friends and trying a different structure of political mobilization and political education, where we call our movement as Mutawasidun, with the goal to connect Palestinians, inspire collective action, and know more about each other's experiences. So what we do is that we gather Palestinians in different cities in 3 sessions, and we talk about the first session is usually about the ongoing Nakba and how it affects our lives. The second is mostly about our struggle and Sumud. And the third is about liberation and post-liberation. So this is kind of formal. And what it gives is that it gives the participants or those who attend the sessions the freedom to engage in any political act, but it's not imposed. You're not telling them, let's discuss just Fatah or Hamas or the current leadership. It's beyond that. So this is non-reactive work and more formal in a sense because it is organized.
Thanks a lot, Rami. Maybe we can hear from Alia and from Ahmed whether there is collaboration across the territories between Gaza, the West Bank, and 1948, and also beyond, because the refugees are beyond there. To you, Alia. Alia, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
So yes, there are some collaborations between the territories of the 48 and the West Bank and Gaza, but they're being challenged by the Israeli government. You know, events cannot easily happen without, without getting special passes to go to these territories. And also, people from Gaza and the West Bank are a bit hesitant to work with people from the 48, under the name of Israel, because they're being marked as traitors sometimes. So they're better off without working with these organizations. I used to work with an organization called the Musawa Center, which is actually an amazing organization that worked with youth, but wasn't only targeting youth. So I think it is necessary to have organizations that only target youth and only work with youth and only try to educate youth about the Palestinian issue and the history and the identity of Palestinians. So this would be my answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alia. Ahmed?
Yes, as I understood the question about if I work with organizations from Palestine 1948.
And from the West Bank and also from the greater diaspora.
Yes, as I mentioned, the reality of the isolation of Gaza Strip, it prevented the youth in general in Gaza from the effective and the normal connection with the rest of the Palestinian people in West Bank and in the other locations. But for me, yes, I connected with activists, not necessarily with the organizations, with the activists from the occupied Palestine 1948 and West Bank. And sometimes when I visited the United States and the European Union, I met tens of the Palestinian people, and it's a tragedy that I cannot meet with the Palestinian activists. They are only a few 10 kilometers from me, but I can meet with them in the US thousands of the miles far from me. So in the Great March of Return, I connected with many activists, including the Jewish organizations. They are they believe in the right of return for the Palestinians. The Zuhort, as example, and the Jewish activists who support the right of the return, and they were coming to the fence of Gaza, and they were protesting in the same time that we are protesting in the other fence. So there were some experiences, but in general, because for me, as example, now I'm 38 years old. I never visited Ramallah. I never visited Jerusalem. I never prayed in Al-Aqsa Mosque. I never visited Asqalan, what's called Ashkol. Even they are a few kilometers from the fence of Gaza Strip. And this is not only me. This is the majority of the Palestinian youth in Gaza Strip.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And it's inspiring to see how we could, as Palestinians, to overcome all these kind of separation walls, fences, borders. Technology did help us, but I think also we do kind of present models of how we kind of break these kind of borders and these checkpoints and go legally or illegally to cross to the other side to kind of be together with our brothers and sisters, no matter where they are. And it's also, I mean, by reality, Palestinians are so spread all over the world, but still we kind of manage to find a common place where we can talk and discuss and organize together. So it's, in a way, it's really, really inspiring. I'm gonna take, before we go back to John's comment, which is really interesting questions about the PA and the elections. I'm gonna take Arona's comment, and Arona says, I personally feel that the struggle of Palestine people is not just limited to Israel-Palestine territory. Yes, the struggle has become international, but the tools and the methods used for the struggle seems very traditional. Any comments? Rami, do you want to pick up this, or Alia or Ahmed? Alia, as a lawyer, sorry, Rami. Ali, as a lawyer, how do you see that?
Sorry, I just need to focus on the question again.
She says that, you know, the tools and methods that are used are very international, are very traditional, sorry. And that our struggle is beyond just Palestine, Israel.
I think she's wrong about the methods being traditional. More of us, you know, the fact that I am here today, the fact that Rami is here today, the fact that you, Arish, and Ahmed are here, we're breaking this traditional form of resistance. We're trying to transcend these limits that are put on us. More, especially in the Sheikh Jarrah case, it became international in days because the youth, especially the youth, and we're talking about them, they're trying to break this traditional form of resistance. So I think, yes, I think our struggle should be more international and people should know more about what's happening here in Palestine. But we're getting there. I think we're getting there.
Thanks a lot, Alia. Arona also give another kind of clarification, if it's the same person, is that more than any other discussion on Palestine, I've heard from most of you, the youth, the right of return. What do you attribute this to? Rami, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arona, for the question. I try to stress the fact that traditional or old methods of advocating for the Palestinian cause are never outdated. When I go to the archives, we have an amazing collection here in Exeter, and you read how the Palestinian intellects were trying to convey our cause to other parts of the world with very limited methods. Now we have internet, we have many ways of spreading the message can reach in seconds. They were able to portray our struggle and as I said, and tie it to imperialism, to Orientalism, to xenophobia. And they managed to mobilize lots of supporters from all over the world. Like this, I was in Mexico 2 years ago, and I found a poster in Mexico City that said, long live Zapata, who was the leader of the Zapatista movement in 1914, and long live Abdel Qadir, the one that from Palestine in 1930s. Abdel Qadir al-Husseini. So traditional doesn't usually mean as primitive or backward or negative, but rather there is a lot to learn from the traditional. And the way to move forward is to combine both the traditional ways and to recycle what has been done, because the Palestinian struggle has reached its peak in the 70s. We were able to advocate in Europe, in the US. We were much more heard than I think we are now. So yeah, that I just wanted to clarify this point.
Thanks a lot, Rami. Ahmed, what's your take on this? Ahmed, are you still with us? We might have lost Ahmed. Ahmed, please let us know if when you're back. But I have to say, I agree on the fact that, you know, the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian struggle goes beyond, of course, Israel and Palestine land. It's also because there's so many players that comes into when we talk about the Palestinian cause. It's created by so many actors who have played historical roles in how this has been created, from the colonization movement of the Zionist people, from the imperialism of the British imperial state, to the Arab kind of involvement today in the Palestinian cause. But then, of course, I mean, the methods are, and I'm not sure exactly what Arona would mean by the methods, are they the resistant methods are traditional, or are the oppression methods are traditional? And in both cases, I would say that both sides are being very creative. Israel is really being creative in how they can continue to break the Palestinian spirit, continue to kind of dismantle our existence. They continue to come up with, more heinous ways of oppressing the Palestinian people inside Palestine or even outside Palestine. Even activists who live in New York are not shielded from the Israeli Zionist oppression, or a person who lives in the East. So I definitely think that the Israelis are, every single day, they have a creative way of trying to kind of, let the world forget about Palestine, while Palestinians continue to come up with so many different ways to say, no, we are staying here. We are going to continue our fight. We will not forget what our grandparents have gone through, and we will not we're not going to live under this oppression forever. So I think in both ways, there are some creative ways of resisting, and the Palestinian history from 1936 of resisting, the longest strike in Palestine till today, with the people resisting every single day, refusing the wall on their land, or the annexation of their olives or their lands in the West Bank, or people in Gaza supporting the resistance. So in both sides, we have definitely continued to kind of say no for the oppressions. Now we'll take one more question, and then we move on to our concluding remark. And I see that John has a burning question regarding I'm going to read to you two questions. The first one, which talks about the PA, says the reason for election Palestinian have not taken place because Israel refused to allow Palestinian East Jerusalem to vote. Is this the speaker see the problem of no election? And it's similar to the previous questions, like, what if Abu Mazen is resign or leave, or maybe he's going to die since he's very old? Would this be a catalytic moment for change and to allow greater youth participation? I think these can go both ways. Rami or Alia, do you want to pick up this?
Actually, I would like to answer Arona's question about the right to return and how we tackle this. Coming from political activism and working with different parties in the Knesset, and the debate about whether we should be in the Knesset, whether we shouldn't. Some parties refused until this moment to be there without having the right to return on the top of their list. So when we speak about our rights here, we also speak about every Palestinian rights everywhere. So this is one of the things that we do on a daily basis regarding the right to return. Also, educational sessions about people's rights to return. Also the march that we hold every year here, and thousands of people participate in. So this is just a glimpse about what we do regarding this.
Thanks a lot, Alia. Over to you, Rami.
As I said earlier, John, I don't think, I personally do not trust the PA. And if the PA actually represents the Palestinian people, they shouldn't be accommodating to what Israel wants. And what did they do after Israel refused allowing Palestinians in East Jerusalem? What actions did they take in order to tackle this? I haven't seen any action that was taken. If they really sincerely wanted an election, they could have done it. And the election problem goes beyond just Palestine. Palestinian refugees and the diaspora are excluded from the Palestinian National Council. So there is other ways to engage Palestinians and to actually do an election. And to also add on what Alia said and the right of return, why do we talk a lot about it? And again, I try not to think about the right of, like, it is very much attached to the land and returning to the land, but we as Palestinians have been deprived from all our rights and the right to live a dignified life, a normal life. So I think about the right of return more in terms of returning to a normal life, to having your family in one place, to having the right to choose, to decide, not to be treated as inferior, not to be exiled all the time, trying to get papers here or residency here or work there. So it is returning to actually being a full human, resisting all acts of dehumanization. It might be a bit philosophical, but it is what it is. It's not just returning to my grandma's house that was taken, because we're now maybe 100 in the family. I don't know if we can fit in that house. So
thanks a lot, Rami. We're gonna have 3 more minutes before we conclude our session, question and answers. But I want to hear if Ahmed has joined us. Ahmed, are you still with us?
I'm with you, Arish.
Go ahead. I
Yes,
think you're from Gaza, and you kind of understand why we haven't had any kind of elections and what are the prospects for these elections.
Yeah, the decision of the President Abbas of the cancellation of the elections was very disappointing for all the people. For me personally, I was run for these elections, for the legitimate elections, and we hope that this was an opportunity to renew the spirit of the Palestinian and to renew the representation. But unfortunately, the PA feels that this elections can threaten its benefits, and this is why they cancelled it. And after that, they also murdered and assassinated Nizar Banat after that. This deepened the frustration among the people. It was an opportunity to for the youth people that they don't find any place to represent themselves to do this if they were as they were an important part of the elections. So I'm not I don't think that there will be a close elections, but maybe after the death of Mahmoud Abbas, I think it will be an opportunity for the Palestinian people to have a new environment that can hold such this elections and renew his leadership.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. Before we hand over to Ilan, few things. Palestinian people are more than 12 million people all over the world. Around 8 million of them are refugees. More than 50% of them are not included in any kind of elections in the West Bank and Gaza. So people like Rami, people like Alia, they are marginalized and they don't have a voice in these kind of elections, because these elections are only for the Palestinian Legislative Council within the West Bank and Gaza. So the rest of the Palestinian people are totally silent. They don't have a say on who gets to lead the Palestinian people. That's already one big problem with our election, and that's why we need to have a much broader election for the Palestinian cause. Now, why Palestinian Authority continue to kind of cancel elections, I think they're just afraid of losing their own kind of seats, simply because we have a big kind of rejection for the PA, as well as a rejection for Hamas to some extent. So any kind of election really threatens their existence as authority. And actually, the United States is warning Israel and telling them, Israel, watch out. The Palestinian Authority is crumbling. It's falling apart. That's not for your favor. So as a Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas and his leadership, they need to think very strategically when to call for the elections. And if there will ever be election, the results are going to be not in their favor, no matter what they do. Is this a catalyst point for youth? I'm not sure yet. We're not there yet. We are kind of planting seeds and it is growing, but the tree has not really got that bigger to kind of, get the fruits off the tree. I'll stop here and thank you so much. Professor Ilan Pape, I don't need to introduce you. Everybody knows you. Over to you.
That's very kind of you. Thank you, Arij. Thank you, Rami, Arij, Alia, Ahmed. It was fascinating, encouraging, despairing. It's a mixed bag of emotions listening to you, knowing myself the reality, or at least some bits of the reality, other bits of the reality. but I think we all learned a lot from your contribution. And again, I want to thank you on behalf of the Movement for Liberation from Nakba for your time and effort. I had a longer concluding remarks, but as the QA was so intriguing and informative and productive, I will be content with a much shorter version of concluding this fantastic webinar. The first thing that came to my mind listening to all of you was that people who follow the situation in Palestine and are supposed to be able to comment on the reality there as scholars, as pundits, as media people, usually say, and one can understand why, that the problem in Palestine is fragmentation, disunity, lack of cohesion, and so on and so forth. It is true on a certain level that there is a problem, of course, of political disunity, fragmentation. Objectively, the fact that the Zionist project fragmented the Palestinian people to different groups is by itself almost an insoluble obstacle for creating a united front and even leadership. But I think what comes out very much, both from the scholarly research and your own opinions, is that we have to be careful by despairing ourselves by saying that there is a disunity, that there is lack of orientation towards the future. When we talk about two such sacred and important issues as the right of return on the other hand, and the idea of a liberated, decolonized Palestine all over Palestine, then we are talking about a unified position. Then we are talking about a clear consensus, that we are talking about a younger generation of Palestinians that wherever they are have a lot in common when they have when they're talking about visions for the future, when they are thinking about the methods of liberation, and when they are thinking of how to recruit not only other Palestinian groups, but also young people around the world to be part of a solidarity movement that can help to transform the reality on the ground. So the first thing I think that comes out, and which is very important, is to be very careful when we talk about disunity on the Palestinian side, and remember that in the face of the more than a century of settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and occupation, there are still some very basic unifying principles that young Palestinians adhere to when they talk about the future. As we saw from Arij, when Arij unpacked the different responses to questions on right of return and statehood, of course, there are innuendos. It's very clear. And since the reality is the way it is now, when you go down to the practicalities of either implementing the right of return or building a one-state solution, it's very clear that for many people, this is not the moment to do it. They don't have the luxury even to do it, but they know exactly what the vision is, even if they leave still open questions of methodology, how to get there, how exactly to do it, what does it mean for everyone, and so on. And I think that's a very important point. Another consensus point, apart from this one state and the question of the right of return, is the way that young Palestinians have to deal with the negative image that the West, prodded by Israel, is trying to impose on the legitimate Palestinian struggle for liberation, including the right to self-defense, which is enshrined by the United Nations and international law. Every act of Palestinian self-defense is immediately depicted by Israel as an act of terrorism, and usually the governments of the West follow suit and accept this kind of depiction. And I think that despite this very powerful machine of propaganda that tries to delegitimize the right of the Palestinian to defend themselves, young Palestinians are not deterred by this kind of hypocrisy. And I think after the beginning of the war in the Ukraine, we saw it so in such starking manner, the way that young Ukrainians who were opposing occupation became heroes in the West. Young Palestinians who were opposing Israeli occupation for years are still depicted as terrorists. So I think it's on the one hand, it's infuriating that this kind of hypocrisy exists. On the other hand, it's very encouraging to know that young Palestinians are not falling trap to this hypocrisy and double talk, and know exactly what their rights are and what are their obligation as part of the Palestinian liberation movement. I would also like to say, and this came strongly in all of you, what you all have said, nobody should idealize any group of people. And I don't think there's any attempt by young Palestinians to idealize the Palestinian people. In fact, the whole project of settler colonialism is based on, especially the Zionist settler colonialist project, is based on the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. And your struggle is to rehumanize yourself and rehumanize yourself in the eyes of the people around you. And rehumanization makes you a normal people, not superior, not something special, but just normal people. And that normality, Israel and before the Zionist movement has totally robbed the Palestinian of throughout its project of settler colonialism. And I think that because this is a normal group of people living in the most abnormal circumstances, we have to appreciate that not every young person can be active. I think many of you pointed out to the fact that being a Palestinian activist, definitely in the Gaza Strip, definitely in the West Bank, but even inside Israel, is a very risky business. It's an existential, you are facing existential dangers when you're doing it. And I think it's true about the refugee camps. And as one of you, I don't remember who, remarked rightly, nowadays, being a Palestinian activist, even in the so-called democracies in the West, is not a very safe avenue to take. You probably don't risk your life as it is, but you can risk your job, your position, and maybe your visa and ability to stay in the country that hosts you if you are a refugee. So I think that's very important to highly appreciate those who are activists, but also feel to have some understanding that not everyone can do this because the hardships of life do not allow that kind of activism. But I think Ahmed said rightly that the March of Return in 2018 showed, and I think also the May 2021 11 days of Intifada showed, that when there is an opportunity, or when there is an occasion that demands a galvanized activity of young people, even young people who are not usually active become very proactive at these particular moments. And had the current leadership and institution enable young people to take a far more important share in the leadership, in the orientation, these occasions would be less infrequent and would happen many more times and would become much more a natural feature of life in the struggle for Palestine. And I think this dual struggle for being liberated from the Zionist colonization on the one hand, and from old institutions and traditions that do not allow enough mobilization for young people, is a huge challenge to the younger Palestinian generation. But it's very encouraging to know that despite these twin challenges, nobody is giving up on this struggle, and it is moved forward by determination and visions like the ones we have today. So thank you so much. I feel very encouraged, as I said, despite a more mixed bag of feelings than when hear about the difficulties that each one of you is facing where they are. I want to thank particularly Ranjan and Hassanel for doing all the hard work to make this webinar possible, and everyone else in the MLN that joined in. And I do hope to see you all in our next webinars and share in our activity. Just to remind you again, this initiative was meant to create the kind of intersectionality that Rami was talking about, not only with the West and not only with Latin America, but to remember that there are many, many people who care about Palestine in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, China, New Zealand, and Australia, and I'm sure I forgot one or two countries that I offended inadvertently. But I think this is very important for us to bring the message to that part of the world where there are so many other young people who know about Palestine, care about Palestine, and could play a very important role in helping us to create a powerful international solidarity movement that would help to decolonize Palestine and liberate it. So thank you very much, and hope to see you all in our next meeting.
Thank you, Professor Pape. So once again, I'll resume the sentiment that thank you everyone for joining us. So we will be putting up the session on our YouTube channel. If anyone wants to go to our Facebook page also to keep up with our next webinar, we encourage you to do so, or visit our website at nakbaliberation.com. And I would like to personally thank Arij, Rami, Ria, and Ahmed for joining us today and sharing your insights, and also showing us why the youth of tomorrow is the most important factor when it comes to continuing our struggles for liberation. So thank you, Professor Pape, as well, for joining us as well. And with that, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.